Christmas Eve, 1945. While most American families were settling in for a peaceful night of holiday anticipation, the Sodder family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, was about to become the epicenter of one of the most haunting mysteries in modern history. At exactly 1:30 a.m. on December 25th, Jenny Sodder jolted awake to a sound that would shatter her life forever, the crackling roar of flames consuming her family's two-story home. George and Jenny Sodder had built more than just a house on their quiet street. They had constructed the American dream. 10 children filled their modest home with laughter, chaos, and the warm energy that only large families possess. George, an Italian immigrant who had found success in the trucking business, believed deeply in hard work and family values. Jenny, devoted and protective, managed their bustling household with the precision of a military commander. Their children ranged from toddlers to teenagers, each with distinct personalities and dreams stretching toward bright futures. But on this Christmas morning, those dreams would vanish into smoke and ash. When Jenny stumbled from her bedroom, thick black smoke was already choking the hallways. The fire had started on the first floor and was spreading with terrifying speed through the wooden structure. George burst into action with the desperation only a father can summon, rushing through the smoke-filled rooms to gather his family. In the chaos and darkness, they managed to escape. George, Jenny, and 4 of their children made it to safety in the frozen yard outside. But 5 children were still inside. 5 innocent souls trapped somewhere in that blazing inferno. Maurice, 14 years old and responsible beyond his years. Martha, 12, who loved to help her mother with household duties. Louis, 9, full of mischief and boundless energy. Jenny, 5, named after her mother and the baby of the family for many years. And Betty, also 5, adopted into the loving Sodder clan just 3 years earlier. George Sodder was not a man who accepted defeat easily. As flames licked higher into the West Virginia sky, he sprinted toward the house, determined to reach his children. The ladder he normally kept against the building was mysteriously missing. His truck, which could have provided elevation to reach the second-story windows, refused to start despite working perfectly just hours before. When he tried to draw water from his well to fight the fire, nothing came up. The water was gone. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. Neighbors began arriving, drawn by the orange glow and desperate screams piercing the winter night. The Fayetteville Fire Department received the call at 1:30 a.m., but their response would prove both delayed and inadequate. By the time firefighters reached the Sodder property, the house had burned with such intensity that the 2-story structure had collapsed completely into its basement foundation. The heat had been so extreme that witnesses described metal objects melting into unrecognizable shapes. As dawn broke on Christmas Day 1945, the Sodder family stood in the gray ash that had once been their home, clutching each other in shared grief and disbelief. The fire chief declared the 5 missing children dead, their bodies presumably consumed by the intense heat. It was a logical conclusion, the kind of tragic Christmas story that newspapers would cover with somber headlines before the world moved on to other concerns. But George Sodder was about to discover something that would transform grief into obsession and launch a mystery that would consume the rest of his life. As he sifted through the smoking ruins in the days following the fire, searching desperately for any trace of his children, he found something impossible. There were no human remains. Not a single bone fragment. Not a tooth. Not even the smallest piece of evidence that 5 children had perished in that basement inferno. The fire had burned hot enough to melt appliances and warp steel, yet somehow it had managed to completely incinerate 5 human bodies without leaving behind so much as a trace of ash. George Sodder might not have been a scientist, but he understood that something was terribly, impossibly wrong with this picture. The scientific impossibility of what happened in that basement would haunt investigators for decades. Human bodies, even when subjected to extreme heat, do not simply vanish without a trace. Crematoriums operate at temperatures between 1,400 and 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 to 3 hours to reduce a body to bone fragments that must then be mechanically ground into ash. Yet the Fayetteville fire chief expected the public to believe that a house fire, burning for approximately 1 hour at temperatures far below crematorium levels, had somehow achieved complete incineration of 5 bodies. George Sodder began his own investigation within days of the fire, driven by a father's intuition that refused to accept the official explanation. He hired a private investigator and consulted with fire experts, each conversation deepening his certainty that his children had not died in that basement. The evidence supporting his theory was compelling and disturbing. First, there was the matter of the family's escape route. George and Jenny had been sleeping on the first floor, along with 2 of their sons. When the fire started, they had easily awakened the children sleeping near them and escaped through ground floor exits. But the 5 missing children had all been sleeping on the second floor, in bedrooms directly above where the fire began. If they had awakened, which seemed likely given the noise and smoke, why hadn't they called out? Why hadn't they attempted to escape through second-story windows, or at least move toward the staircase? The silence from upstairs was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire tragedy. In every house fire where children perish, there are typically sounds of distress, crying, calling for parents, or attempts to escape. The Sodders heard nothing from the second floor except the crackling of flames. Then there was the suspicious behavior of the family's telephone. When Jenny attempted to call the fire department, she discovered the phone line was dead. The phone had been working perfectly earlier that evening when relatives called to wish the family a Merry Christmas. The line had been severed sometime during the night, cutting off the Sodders' ability to summon help immediately. But the most disturbing discovery came from examining the fire's origin and progression. Fire investigators determined that the blaze had started on the first floor, near the electrical fuse box. However, George had recently upgraded his electrical system and had it inspected just months before the fire. The wiring was modern and up to code, making an electrical fire highly unlikely. More puzzling was the fire's behavior. House fires typically spread upward due to heat and smoke rising through the structure. In this case, witnesses reported that the second floor appeared to be burning as intensely as the first floor, as if the fire had somehow started simultaneously on both levels. This pattern suggested accelerant use, a deliberate arson rather than an accidental fire. George's investigation revealed another crucial detail that investigators had overlooked: the strange behavior of neighbors and witnesses on the night of the fire. Mrs. Ida Crutchfield, who lived nearby, claimed she had seen the Sodder house burning as early as 12:30 a.m., a full hour before the family reported discovering the fire. If her timeline was accurate, it meant the fire had been burning for much longer than anyone realized, and that someone other than the Sodders had observed it first. Even more disturbing was the account of a passing motorist who later told police he had seen a man watching the burning house from the hillside above the Sodder property. The figure stood motionless in the darkness, observing the destruction without making any attempt to help or call for assistance. When firefighters finally arrived, this mysterious observer had vanished. The physical evidence continued to contradict the official theory of 5 children dying in the basement. When George hired heavy equipment to excavate the site weeks after the fire, the search revealed household items that had survived the blaze: dishes, appliances, and personal belongings that somehow remained intact despite temperatures supposedly hot enough to completely destroy human bodies. Most telling of all was what the excavation didn't find. In a basement where 5 children had allegedly burned to death, there should have been remnants of beds, mattresses, clothing, shoes, or personal items that the children would have had with them. Instead, the basement contained only the debris from the house structure itself, as if the second floor had been empty when it collapsed. George Sodder was beginning to understand that his children's disappearance might not have been the tragic accident everyone assumed. The evidence pointed towards something far more sinister: a carefully planned operation designed to look like a deadly house fire while concealing the truth about 5 missing children. The Sodder family had been living under a shadow of threats and intimidation for months before that fateful Christmas Eve, a pattern of harassment that George would later realize served as a chilling prelude to the night his children vanished. Understanding these threats would prove crucial to unraveling the mystery, as they painted a picture of a family deliberately targeted by forces with both motive and means to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. George Sodder was not a man who kept his opinions to himself. particularly when it came to the political situation brewing in his homeland of Italy. As World War II raged across Europe, George had become increasingly vocal in his criticism of Benito Mussolini's fascist regime. At local gatherings, in his business dealings, and within the Italian-American community of Fayetteville, George spoke openly about his disgust for fascism and his belief that Mussolini was leading Italy toward destruction. This stance made him enemies among certain factions of Italian Americans who either supported Mussolini or preferred to remain neutral in such dangerous times. In small-town West Virginia during the 1940s, political divisions could run deep and personal, creating rifts that extended far beyond mere disagreements into the realm of genuine hostility. The first serious threat came in the autumn of 1945, just 2 months before the fire. A man George didn't recognize approached him outside his trucking business and delivered a message that would prove prophetic in its specificity. "Your house will go up in smoke," the stranger warned, his voice carrying the weight of certainty rather than speculation, "and your children will be destroyed. You wait and see." George dismissed the threat initially, assuming it was the kind of empty intimidation that sometimes accompanied heated political discussions. But as the weeks passed, more unsettling incidents began to accumulate around the Sodder family, each one seemingly innocuous by itself, but forming a disturbing pattern when viewed together. Local law enforcement, rather than providing protection, seemed to be part of the problem. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, had taken to making comments around town about George's un-American political views and his criticism of wartime policies. Morris had publicly questioned whether someone who spoke so negatively about American allies should be allowed to operate a successful business in their community. The harassment escalated in December when George discovered that someone had been tampering with his truck. On multiple occasions, he found that wires had been cut or disconnected, causing mechanical problems that required expensive repairs. His business competitors began underbidding his trucking contracts with impossible pricing, suggesting coordination aimed at damaging his livelihood. More disturbing were the reports from his children about strangers watching their house. Several of the Sodder children mentioned seeing unfamiliar men parked on the street or walking slowly past their property, always during daylight hours when George was away at work. These observers never approached the house or spoke to anyone, but their presence was consistent enough that even the youngest children began to notice and comment on it. The telephone harassment began in early December, with anonymous calls threatening the family in ways that were specific enough to demonstrate intimate knowledge of their daily routines. Callers knew when George left for work, when the children walked to school, and even details about their holiday preparations. Someone was clearly monitoring the family's activities with the kind of systematic attention that suggested professional surveillance. 3 days before Christmas, George received the most explicit threat yet. A caller told him that his house would burn and that he would never see his children again unless he stopped his troublemaking political activities. The voice was calm and matter-of-fact, delivered with the confidence of someone who possessed both the means and the determination to follow through on their promises. George reported these incidents to local police, but found little sympathy or assistance. Officers suggested that he was overreacting to normal community tensions and that his own inflammatory rhetoric was responsible for the negative attention his family was receiving. The message was clear: George Sodder could not count on law enforcement for protection. On December 23rd, the day before the fire, George made a decision that would later torment him with guilt and regret. He had planned to install additional locks on the house and had considered sending some of the children to stay with relatives until the threat subsided. But Christmas was approaching. The children were excited about their celebrations, and disrupting their holiday seemed like letting the intimidators win. Instead, George chose to believe that the threats were empty bluster designed to frighten rather than actual promises of violence. He convinced himself that even his enemies wouldn't harm innocent children, especially during Christmas. It was a miscalculation that would haunt him for the rest of his life, as he realized too late that the people threatening his family had been deadly serious about their intentions. The pattern of harassment now seemed like a systematic campaign to isolate and terrorize the Sodders before striking with devastating precision on the night when they would be most vulnerable and least likely to receive immediate help. The 24 hours preceding the fire were filled with incidents so bizarre and specific that they could only be understood in retrospect as the final preparations for an operation that had been months in the planning. Each strange occurrence, dismissed by the Sodders as mere coincidence at the time, would later reveal itself as a deliberate step in a carefully orchestrated plan to ensure the family's vulnerability when the moment of attack arrived. The first unusual visitor appeared at the Sodder home on the morning of December 23rd. A woman none of them recognized knocked on the door, claiming to be selling life insurance. When Jenny answered, the stranger spent an unusually long time examining the interior of the house, her eyes moving systematically across the layout, the staircase, and the positions of doors and windows. Her questions were strange and overly specific, asking about the family's sleep schedules, which rooms the children occupied, and whether they typically locked their doors at night. Most disturbing was the woman's behavior when she noticed the fuse box in the hallway. She lingered near it, asking detailed questions about the electrical system that seemed far beyond the normal interest of an insurance saleswoman. When Jenny politely declined to purchase any policies, the visitor didn't seem disappointed or frustrated as a legitimate salesperson would be. Instead, she appeared satisfied, as if she had accomplished her true purpose simply by gaining access to the house. That same afternoon brought another peculiar encounter. A man driving a truck stopped at George's business and requested directions to a location that was clearly visible from where they stood. During their brief conversation, the stranger made pointed comments about George's successful trucking operation and his beautiful family, mentioning specific details about the children's ages and school activities that could only have come from careful observation. The man's truck bore license plates from Pennsylvania, and George noticed several other men sitting inside the vehicle, all of them watching the conversation with an intensity that seemed inappropriate for a simple request for directions. When George provided the information requested, the driver made a comment that would echo ominously just hours later. It would be terrible if something happened to such a nice family during the holidays. As evening approached on December 23rd, the Sodder children reported seeing a man lurking near their property line, partially concealed by trees, but clearly observing the house. When George went outside to investigate, the figure melted back into the darkness, but not before the children got a good look at him. They described a tall man in dark clothing who appeared to be taking notes or making sketches while watching their home. The most significant incident occurred around 10 p.m. that night, when the family's telephone began exhibiting strange behavior. Instead of the normal dial tone, they heard fragments of conversations between people they didn't recognize. The voices discussed logistics and timing in vague terms that made little sense to the Sodders, but would later seem like intercepted communications between conspirators coordinating their final preparations. Jenny attempted to call her sister to report the phone problems, but found that while she could sometimes hear other conversations, her own calls wouldn't connect properly. The telephone company had no explanation for the malfunction when George contacted them the next morning, December 24th. A repair technician was scheduled to investigate after the Christmas holiday, a delay that would prove catastrophic. Christmas Eve morning brought yet another mysterious visitor. This time, a well-dressed man appeared at the door claiming to represent a company interested in purchasing one of George's trucks. His timing was suspicious, approaching a family on Christmas Eve to discuss a business transaction that could easily have waited until after the holiday. Like the insurance woman the day before, this visitor seemed more interested in observing the family's routine than in conducting actual business. The man noticed the children's presents already wrapped under the Christmas tree and made casual comments about how nice it must be to have such a large family gathered together for the holidays. He lingered in the doorway, his eyes moving constantly around the interior as if memorizing details. When George mentioned that the family would be attending Christmas Eve services at their church, the visitor seemed particularly interested in their timeline and what time they typically returned home. Throughout Christmas Eve day, neighbors later reported seeing several unfamiliar vehicles parked at various points around the Sodder property. The cars didn't remain in one location long enough to seem obviously suspicious, but they maintained a pattern of surveillance that kept the house under constant observation. License plates were noted from several different states, suggesting coordination between multiple groups or individuals. The final preparation came that evening when the Sodders discovered their ladder was missing from its usual position against the side of the house. George had used it just days earlier to hang Christmas decorations and was certain he had left it securely in place. A thorough search of the property revealed that the ladder had been completely removed, not simply knocked over or displaced by wind. Even more disturbing was the discovery that someone had apparently tampered with George's trucks during the night. Both vehicles, which had been running perfectly, suddenly developed mechanical problems that made them unreliable. The timing was particularly suspicious given that the trucks had been serviced recently and were in excellent working condition. As the family prepared for bed on Christmas Eve, they were essentially isolated. Their telephone was malfunctioning, their vehicles were compromised, and their normal means of emergency escape had been systematically removed. The stage was set for an operation that required the family to be helpless when the moment of crisis arrived. The response to the Sodder house fire revealed a web of delays, malfunctions, and suspicious behavior that suggested the emergency services themselves may have been compromised or deliberately hindered. What should have been a coordinated rescue effort instead became a series of inexplicable failures that ensured maximum damage while providing minimal assistance to a family in desperate need. When Jenny Sodder discovered the telephone line was dead at 1:30 a.m., she immediately sent her son Marion to alert neighbors and call for help. Marion ran through the frozen streets to the nearest house with a working phone, but his attempts to reach the fire department resulted in another mysterious malfunction. The neighbor's phone, which had been working normally just hours before, suddenly produced only static and disconnected tones. Desperate to summon assistance, Marion continued running to additional neighbors until he finally found a functioning telephone at a house nearly a mile from his family's burning home. By the time he successfully reached the fire department, precious minutes had been lost, minutes that could have meant the difference between life and death for 5 trapped children. But even after the fire department received the emergency call, their response defied all logic and protocol. The Fayetteville Volunteer Fire Department was located less than 3 miles from the Sodder property, a distance that should have taken no more than 10 minutes to traverse even on icy December roads. Instead, firefighters didn't arrive at the scene until nearly 8 a.m., more than 6 hours after the initial call for help. Fire Chief F.J. Morris later claimed that the department's fire truck had experienced mechanical problems that prevented an immediate response. This explanation might have been believable if not for the testimony of multiple witnesses who reported seeing the fire truck parked at the fire station throughout the early morning hours, with no apparent signs of mechanical distress or repair activity. Even more damning was the revelation that the fire department had received additional calls about the Sodder house fire from other concerned neighbors, yet these calls also failed to prompt an immediate response. It appeared that multiple emergency calls about the same large house fire were being deliberately ignored or deprioritized by the very people entrusted with responding to such emergencies. When firefighters finally arrived at the Sodder property, their behavior was puzzling and inadequate. Instead of immediately focusing on rescue operations or searching for survivors, they seemed more interested in controlling access to the scene and preventing family members from getting too close to the ruins. George Sodder was told to stay back while professionals handled the situation, but the professionals appeared to be doing very little actual investigating. The fire department's equipment proved mysteriously ineffective throughout their delayed response. Their main hose developed leaks that prevented adequate water pressure, while their ladder truck experienced mechanical problems that made it impossible to reach the second-story areas where the missing children had been sleeping. These failures seemed almost too convenient given the equipment had been recently serviced and was reported to be in excellent working condition. Most suspicious was the fire department's immediate conclusion about the fate of the 5 missing children. Without conducting any thorough search of the ruins or waiting for the debris to cool sufficiently for proper investigation, Chief Morris declared the children dead and their bodies consumed by the intense heat. This determination was made while the basement was still smoldering and any meaningful examination was impossible. When George Sodder requested permission to search the ruins himself, he was told that the scene was too dangerous and that any disturbance of the debris might compromise the investigation. However, no meaningful investigation ever took place. The fire was officially classified as accidental, caused by electrical problems, and the case was considered closed within days of the incident. The coroner's involvement in the case proved equally problematic. Dr. C.C. Tinsley arrived at the scene but conducted no systematic examination of the ruins. Instead, he relied entirely on Chief Morris's assessment and officially declared the 5 children dead without ever finding physical evidence of their deaths. This violation of standard procedure would later become a source of legal challenges, but at the time it served to expedite the official conclusion of the case. Adding to the family's frustration was the behavior of local law enforcement. Sheriff William Pitzenbarger treated the fire as a routine accident and showed little interest in investigating the suspicious circumstances surrounding the incident. When George tried to share his concerns about the threats his family had received and the strange events leading up to the fire, officers dismissed his theories as the desperate imagination of a grieving father. The official investigation, such as it was, lasted less than a week. No interviews were conducted with neighbors who might have witnessed suspicious activity in the days before the fire. No analysis was performed on the telephone lines that had been severed. No examination was made of the missing ladder or the mechanical problems with George's trucks. The case was closed with remarkable speed, as if authorities were eager to prevent any deeper investigation. Perhaps most telling was the fire department's refusal to allow George to hire his own investigators or bring in outside experts to examine the scene. When he attempted to arrange for independent fire analysis specialists to review the evidence, he was informed that the scene had already been disturbed and that any additional investigation would be pointless. This pattern of obstruction and delay ensured that by the time George was finally able to conduct his own search of the ruins, weeks had passed and crucial evidence had been lost or contaminated. The systematic failure of every emergency system designed to protect his family pointed to something far more sinister than mere incompetence or unfortunate timing. When George Sodder finally gained access to excavate the ruins of his home in February 1946, nearly 2 months after the fire, what he discovered would shatter every official explanation and launch a mystery that defied the laws of physics, forensic science, and human logic. The basement that supposedly contained the cremated remains of 5 children instead revealed evidence so contradictory to the official story that it seemed to exist in an alternate reality. The excavation began with heavy machinery carefully removing layers of debris, ash, and collapsed structural materials. George had hired professional excavation equipment and brought in witnesses to document everything they found. He was determined that no one could later claim he had missed evidence or conducted an inadequate search. What emerged from that frozen ground would haunt investigators for decades. The first shocking discovery was the complete absence of human remains. In a space where 5 bodies had allegedly been incinerated, there were no bone fragments, no teeth, no hair, no clothing remnants. Nothing that indicated human beings had ever been present during the fire. This absence was not simply unusual. It was scientifically impossible given the conditions described by fire officials. To understand the magnitude of this impossibility, George consulted with crematorium operators and fire investigation experts. They explained that human bones require sustained temperatures of at least 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours to be reduced to ash. Even then, substantial bone fragments remain that must be mechanically pulverized. House fires, which typically reach maximum temperatures of 1,200 degrees and burn for much shorter durations, simply cannot achieve complete cremation of human remains. More puzzling still was what the excavation did reveal. Household items that should have been destroyed by temperatures hot enough to vaporize human bodies were found intact or only partially damaged. Metal objects showed heat damage consistent with a typical house fire, not the extreme temperatures that would be required for complete human cremation. Dishes, silverware, and appliances bore scorch marks, but remained recognizable and structurally sound. The basement also contained something that would become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the case: a small pile of bones and what appeared to be internal organs. When George discovered these remains, he initially felt a mixture of relief and horror, believing he had finally found proof of his children's fate. However, laboratory analysis would reveal a truth even more disturbing than their absence. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for expert examination. Dr. Oscar T. Schultz, a respected forensic anthropologist, conducted a thorough analysis and reached conclusions that demolished the official fire theory. The bones, he determined, were not from children but from an adult, and they showed no evidence of having been burned in the fire. In fact, the remains appeared to have been placed in the basement after the fire had occurred. Even more shocking was Dr. Schultz's discovery that the bones showed evidence of having been cut with a sharp instrument, suggesting they came from a body that had been deliberately dismembered. The internal organ material proved to be beef liver, not human tissue. Someone had apparently planted these false remains in the basement, perhaps expecting a cursory investigation that would accept any organic material as proof of the children's deaths. The deliberate placement of false evidence suggested a level of sophistication and premeditation that transformed the case from a possible kidnapping into something resembling an intelligence operation. Whoever was responsible had anticipated that the basement would eventually be searched and had taken steps to provide misleading evidence that would satisfy investigators while concealing the true fate of the missing children. George's excavation revealed other anomalies that supported his theory of deliberate deception. The pattern of debris in the basement showed clear signs of disturbance after the fire had burned out. Areas that should have contained the heaviest structural collapse instead showed evidence of having been dug up and refilled. Someone had been in that basement after the fire, moving materials and possibly removing evidence. The electrical system that allegedly caused the fire also told a different story upon close examination. The fuse box and wiring showed damage consistent with deliberate sabotage rather than accidental malfunction. Wires had been cut rather than burned, and the damage patterns suggested someone with knowledge of electrical systems had carefully disabled the house's power while making it appear to be fire damage. Perhaps most revealing was the discovery of accelerant residue in multiple locations throughout the basement. Fire investigation techniques of the 1940s were less sophisticated than modern methods, but even then it was possible to detect evidence of gasoline or kerosene use. The basement showed clear signs that flammable liquids had been used to ensure rapid and intense burning, proof that the fire was deliberately set rather than accidental. The timeline of the fire's progression also defied explanation. Witnesses had reported seeing flames on both the first and second floors simultaneously, which contradicted normal fire behavior. Accelerants found in the basement suggested the fire had been set in multiple locations to ensure maximum destruction in minimum time, giving any occupants little chance of escape while ensuring complete structural collapse. George arranged for independent fire investigators to examine his findings, hoping to build a case that would force authorities to reopen their investigation. However, these experts faced the same obstruction from local officials that had hampered George's own efforts. Their requests for official cooperation were denied, and their findings were dismissed without consideration. The evidence from the basement excavation painted a picture of an elaborate deception designed to convince the world that 5 children had died in an accidental house fire. Instead, it revealed a carefully planned operation involving arson, evidence planting, and systematic cover-up that reached into the highest levels of local government and law enforcement. In the months and years following the fire, reported sightings of the missing Sodder children began emerging from across the United States, creating a nationwide mystery that would span decades and generate thousands of tips, leads, and heartbreaking false hopes. Each sighting brought the desperate parents rushing toward what they prayed might be a reunion, only to discover another dead end in their endless search for answers. The first significant sighting came just 6 months after the fire, when a hotel manager in Charleston, West Virginia contacted George with an extraordinary claim. For children matching the descriptions of the missing Sodders had been staying at his establishment with a group of adults who refused to provide identification or explain their relationship to the children. The youngsters appeared well cared for, but seemed frightened and reluctant to speak when addressed directly. What made this sighting particularly compelling was the hotel manager's observation that one of the children had a distinctive scar that perfectly matched a mark on Louis Sodder's forehead. The boy had also responded when someone in the lobby mentioned the name Louis, turning quickly before being hurried away by one of the accompanying adults. By the time George arrived in Charleston to investigate, the mysterious group had checked out, leaving no forwarding address and paying their bill in cash to avoid creating any paper trail. Throughout 1947 and 1948, similar reports flooded in from across the eastern United States. A school teacher in Florida reported seeing children who matched the Sodder descriptions attending classes under different names with forged enrollment documents. A store clerk in Ohio described serving a group of children who spoke in whispers and seemed terrified of the adults supervising them. Each report shared common elements. The children appeared healthy but fearful. They were always accompanied by stern adults who discouraged interaction, and they seemed to be living under assumed identities. The most tantalizing lead came from a former prisoner who contacted George in 1949 with a story that seemed too specific to be fabricated. The man claimed that while incarcerated, he had shared a cell with someone who bragged about participating in the Sodder kidnapping. According to this account, the 5 children had been taken to a location in Kentucky where they were being raised by accomplices in the operation. The informant provided detailed descriptions of the children's new living situation and even drew a rough map showing the location where they were supposedly being held. George immediately traveled to Kentucky with private investigators, but their search of the indicated area revealed only abandoned farmland with no signs of recent habitation. Whether the tip was deliberately misleading or simply inaccurate remains unclear, but it represented the kind of cruel false hope that would torment the Sodder family for decades. Photography became both a tool of hope and a source of anguish for George and Jenny Sodder. They distributed thousands of photographs showing what their children had looked like at the time of their disappearance, along with age-progressed images showing how they might appear as they grew older. These photos appeared in newspapers, on milk cartons, and eventually on billboards across multiple states. The most famous photograph in the case arrived in 1968, more than 20 years after the disappearance. Someone mailed the Sodders a picture showing a young man who bore a striking resemblance to what Louis Sodder might look like as an adult. On the back of the photograph, someone had written Louis Sodder and "I love Brother Frankie" in what appeared to be a child's handwriting, followed by numbers that might have represented a location code. The photograph had been postmarked from Kentucky, lending credibility to earlier reports that the children might have been taken to that state. However, efforts to trace the photograph's origin proved impossible, and attempts to locate the young man in the picture were unsuccessful. The image became one of the most widely circulated missing person photographs in American history, but it never led to a confirmed identification. Private investigators hired by the Sodders documented hundreds of potential sightings over the years, creating files that eventually filled several cabinets with reports, photographs, and investigative notes. Many of these sightings shared disturbing common elements that suggested a coordinated effort to keep the children hidden while allowing occasional glimpses that would prevent the case from being completely forgotten. Several witnesses reported seeing groups of children who matched the Sodder descriptions being moved from location to location, as if they were being systematically relocated to avoid detection. These movements seemed to follow patterns that suggested professional coordination rather than random criminal activity, leading investigators to theorize that the children might have been taken by an organized network with resources and connections spanning multiple states. The psychological toll of these endless false leads was devastating for George and Jenny Sodder. Each promising sighting brought renewed hope that their children might still be alive, followed by crushing disappointment when investigations proved fruitless. The constant cycle of hope and despair began to consume their lives, affecting their relationships with their surviving children and their ability to find peace with their loss. What made the sightings particularly torturous was their consistency with the theory that the children were still alive. Unlike cases where missing persons are presumed dead, the Sodder case offered tantalizing evidence that the 5 children might have survived their disappearance and were being raised under new identities somewhere in America. This possibility made it impossible for the parents to grieve normally or accept their children's death, as most bereaved families eventually must. By the 1960s, the search for the missing Sodder children had become a nationwide phenomenon that captured public imagination and generated widespread sympathy for the determined parents who refused to give up hope. In 1952, 7 years after that devastating Christmas Eve, George and Jenny Sodder made a decision that would transform their private anguish into a public crusade and create one of the most haunting landmarks in American highway history. Frustrated by the lack of progress in official investigations and driven by their unwavering belief that their children were still alive, they erected a billboard along Route 16 that would become a symbol of parental determination and unresolved mystery. The billboard towered over the busy highway that connected West Virginia to neighboring states, impossible to ignore for the thousands of motorists who passed beneath it daily. Against a stark white background, 5 photographs showed the faces of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty as they had appeared on their last Christmas Eve together. Below their images, bold black letters proclaimed a message that would haunt travelers for decades. Fire of unknown origin. 5 children missing. Reward 5,000 for information. But the billboard represented more than just a missing persons advertisement. It was a declaration of war against whoever had taken the Sodder children and a promise that their parents would never stop searching. George had positioned it strategically on one of the region's busiest highways, ensuring maximum visibility for his message of defiance and desperate hope. The Sodders' commitment to keeping their children's case in the public eye extended far beyond the billboard. They printed thousands of flyers containing the children's photographs and distributed them at truck stops, restaurants, and businesses across multiple states. George used his connections in the trucking industry to spread the word among drivers who traveled extensive routes, turning America's highways into an informal network of amateur investigators. Jenny Sodder became a fixture at state fairs, shopping centers, and community events, always carrying photographs of her missing children and hoping to encounter someone who might recognize them. She developed an encyclopedic knowledge of missing children cases across the country, networking with other devastated parents and sharing information that might prove relevant to multiple investigations. The billboard became a pilgrimage destination for people intrigued by unsolved mysteries, drawing visitors from across the country who wanted to see the famous landmark and learn more about the case. Some came out of genuine sympathy and desire to help. Others were drawn by morbid curiosity about one of America's most puzzling disappearances. Regardless of their motivations, each visitor helped keep the case alive in public consciousness. Local reaction to the billboard was mixed and often hostile. Many Fayetteville residents wished the Sodders would accept their children's death and allow the community to move past the tragedy. The constant reminder of the unsolved case made some people uncomfortable, particularly those who suspected that powerful local figures might have been involved in covering up the truth about what happened that Christmas Eve. Business owners complained that the billboard's grim message was bad for tourism and economic development. Politicians suggested that the Sodders' refusal to accept the official explanation was divisive and harmful to community morale. But George and Jenny remained unmoved by such criticism, convinced that someone in the passing traffic might hold the key to finding their children. The billboard's message evolved over the years as the Sodders refined their approach and incorporated new information. They added age-progressed photographs showing how the children might appear as they grew older, updated contact information, and eventually increased the reward amount as their desperation intensified and their resources allowed. Media coverage of the billboard brought national attention to the case, with newspapers and television programs featuring stories about the determined parents who refused to give up hope. These articles generated additional tips and sightings, creating a feedback loop that kept the investigation active even when official law enforcement had long since moved on to other priorities. The psychological impact of maintaining the billboard for decades took a tremendous toll on the entire Sodder family. The surviving children grew up in the shadow of their missing siblings, constantly reminded of the family's loss and their parents' consuming obsession with finding answers. Some family members eventually urged George and Jenny to take down the billboard and try to find peace, but the parents couldn't bear the thought that removing their children's photographs might cause someone with crucial information to remain silent. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. By the 1980s, the billboard had become a landmark as famous as any official historical marker in the region. Travelers would plan routes specifically to see the haunting display, and the case had inspired books, documentaries, and countless amateur investigations. The Sodder children's faces had become some of the most recognizable missing person photographs in American history. The billboard also served as a form of psychological warfare against whoever had taken the children. George believed that keeping the case visible would eventually make the perpetrators nervous enough to make mistakes or prompt former accomplices to come forward with information. The constant public attention ensured that the case could never be quietly forgotten, maintaining pressure on anyone with guilty knowledge. Local law enforcement continued to receive periodic calls about the billboard, with some callers providing tips while others complained about its presence. The sign had become a lightning rod for community tensions, dividing those who admired the Sodders' persistence from those who wished they would finally accept defeat and allow the case to fade into history. As George and Jenny aged, the billboard became their legacy, a permanent monument to parental love and the refusal to surrender hope even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The 1960s brought unexpected developments that would elevate the Sodder case from a local mystery into a matter of potential national security, revealing connections that stretched far beyond the small-town politics and personal vendettas that had originally been suspected. What emerged from newly declassified documents and federal investigations would suggest that the disappearance of 5 children might have been connected to Cold War espionage networks operating within American immigrant communities. The breakthrough came when George Sodder's persistence finally caught the attention of federal investigators who had been quietly monitoring Italian-American communities for suspected fascist sympathizers and foreign agents. The FBI had maintained files on various Italian immigrants who had been vocal about politics during World War II, and George Sodder's name appeared in several of these classified documents. What the FBI files revealed was both validating and terrifying for the Sodder family. Federal agents had been aware of threats against George as early as 1944, more than a year before the fire. Intelligence reports documented a network of individuals who viewed George's anti-Mussolini statements as dangerous to their own political activities and business interests. Some of these individuals had connections to organized crime families that were suspected of maintaining ties to fascist elements in Italy. The declassified documents showed that the FBI had been investigating a conspiracy involving several prominent figures in West Virginia politics and business who were allegedly working to silence Italian Americans whose political views conflicted with certain wartime interests. George Sodder had been identified as a primary target for intimidation, but federal agents had not anticipated that the threats would escalate to violence against his family. Most shocking was the revelation that the FBI had advanced knowledge of plans to deal with the Sodder problem during the 1945 Christmas season. An informant within the conspiracy had reported that something significant was being planned against the family, but the intelligence had not been specific enough to prevent the tragedy or even to prompt a warning to the Sodders. The federal investigation revealed that several local officials, including Fire Chief F.J. Morris and members of the Sheriff's Department, had financial and political connections to the individuals who had been threatening George Sodder. This web of relationships explained the inadequate response to the fire and the rush to close the case without proper investigation. Law enforcement had not simply been incompetent, they had been actively complicit in covering up evidence. Federal agents also uncovered evidence that the missing Sodder children might have been taken as part of a broader human trafficking network that specialized in providing new identities for children who needed to disappear. This network allegedly had connections to both domestic criminal organizations and international espionage operations that required untraceable individuals for various purposes. The possibility that the children had been absorbed into spy networks was particularly disturbing given the timeline of their disappearance. The Cold War was intensifying in 1945, and intelligence agencies on all sides were recruiting assets and establishing deep cover operations. Children taken at young ages could be indoctrinated and trained for long-term intelligence work, their original identities completely erased through years of psychological conditioning. FBI interviews with former members of the conspiracy revealed additional details about the night of the fire. The operation had been planned for months, with multiple teams assigned different responsibilities. One group was responsible for disabling the family's communications and transportation, another for setting the fire and ensuring it burned completely, and a third for removing the children and transporting them to a secure location. The precision of the operation explained many of the mysterious circumstances that had puzzled investigators for decades. The telephone lines had been cut by professionals who knew exactly how to disable communications without leaving obvious evidence of sabotage. The children had been removed from the house before the fire reached the second floor, which explained why they had never called out for help or attempted to escape. Most significantly, the federal investigation revealed that the children had been taken alive and were initially held at a location less than 50 miles from their family home. From there, they had been transported through a network of safe houses that eventually led to permanent placement with families who had been paid to raise them under new identities. The FBI files contained tantalizing hints about the children's ultimate fate, but frustratingly few concrete details. Several documents referenced successful placement of the subjects and integration into appropriate households, suggesting that at least some of the children had survived their ordeal and were being raised as if they were the biological children of their new families. However, the federal investigation also revealed the limitations of 1940s law enforcement and the jurisdictional complications that had prevented effective action. By the time FBI agents had pieced together the full scope of the conspiracy, several years had passed and key evidence had been destroyed or lost. Many of the original conspirators had died, moved away, or simply refused to cooperate with federal investigators. The declassified documents showed that the FBI had continued investigating the case throughout the 1950s and 1960s, following up on sightings and tips while building a comprehensive understanding of the network that had been responsible for the kidnapping. However, the agency's ability to act was constrained by the need to protect ongoing intelligence operations and the difficulty of proving crimes that had been carefully planned to look like accidents. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the revelation that federal agents believed they had identified at least 2 of the missing children by the mid-1960s, but were unable to act on this information due to legal complications and the children's integration into their new lives. The moral and legal questions surrounding forced reunions with families the children might no longer remember had proven insurmountable for law enforcement agencies. Nearly 8 decades have passed since 5 children vanished into the smoke and flames of that Christmas Eve tragedy, yet the Sodder case remains as compelling and unsolvable as ever, a testament to the enduring power of unanswered questions and a family's refusal to surrender hope. The passage of time has brought new investigative techniques, fresh perspectives, and occasional breakthroughs, but it has also carried away most of the original witnesses and participants, leaving behind only fragments of truth scattered across decades of speculation and sorrow. George Sodder died in 1969, 24 years after losing his children, having spent more than half his remaining life searching for answers that would forever elude him. Jenny continued the quest alone for another 21 years until her death in 1989, maintaining the billboard, following leads, and refusing to accept that her children were gone forever. Their dedication became legendary, inspiring countless amateur investigators and establishing the Sodder case as one of America's most enduring missing persons mysteries. Modern forensic technology has opened new possibilities for investigating the case, though many crucial pieces of evidence were lost or contaminated in the decades before DNA analysis and advanced fire investigation techniques became available. Computer-age progression software has created updated images showing how the missing children might appear today as senior citizens, but these digital reconstructions serve more as symbols of hope than practical investigative tools. The internet age has breathed new life into the case, with online communities dedicated to analyzing every detail and developing new theories about what happened that night. Digital archives have made previously inaccessible documents available to researchers, while social media platforms have connected distant relatives and amateur investigators who share information and coordinate searches across the country. Contemporary investigators have raised disturbing questions about similar disappearances in other immigrant communities during the same time period, suggesting that the Sodder case might have been part of a broader pattern of politically motivated kidnappings that were covered up by authorities. These connections remain largely theoretical, but they point toward a darker chapter in American history, where ethnic minorities faced systematic persecution that extended far beyond the well-documented injustices that have been officially acknowledged. The surviving Sodder children have taken different approaches to their family's tragedy over the decades. Some have continued their parents' search with quiet determination, following leads, and maintaining contact with investigators who remain interested in the case. Others have chosen to focus on their own families and careers, believing that the truth died with the original conspirators and that continued investigation only perpetuates pain without offering realistic hope for resolution. Scientific analysis of the evidence collected over the years has supported many of George Sodder's original theories about the fire being deliberately set and the children being taken alive. Fire investigation experts who have reviewed the case files agree that the official explanation of accidental electrical fire is implausible given the physical evidence and witness accounts. The absence of human remains in the basement continues to defy explanation if 5 children actually died in the fire. However, the passage of time has also revealed the limitations of even the most determined investigation. Key witnesses have died, crucial documents have been lost or destroyed, and the trail of evidence has grown cold beyond any realistic hope of following. The children, if they survived, would now be in their 80s and 90s, possibly unaware of their true origins or the family that never stopped searching for them. The case has inspired numerous books, documentaries, and television programs, each offering different theories and interpretations, but none providing the definitive answers that George and Jenny Sodder spent their lives seeking. The story has become part of American folklore, a cautionary tale about the limits of justice and the power of parental love to transcend seemingly impossible circumstances. Legal experts have noted that even if the missing children were located today, the statute of limitations would protect most of the original conspirators from prosecution. The passage of decades has transformed what was once a criminal case into a historical mystery, more suitable for academic analysis than active law enforcement investigation. The billboard that haunted Route 16 for nearly 4 decades was finally removed in the 1990s, not because the family had given up hope, but because age and weather had made it structurally unsound. Its removal marked the end of an era, though the case continues to generate interest among new generations of investigators and mystery enthusiasts who discover the story through books, documentaries, and internet research. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Sodder case lies not in its unsolved mystery, but in its demonstration of the lengths to which parents will go in search of their children. George and Jenny Sodder's refusal to accept defeat, their willingness to spend their life savings on investigations, and their determination to keep their children's memory alive have inspired countless other families facing similar tragedies. The case also serves as a reminder of how easily evidence can be lost, witnesses silenced, and truth obscured when powerful interests align against justice. The systematic failures that prevented a proper investigation in 1945 continue to offer lessons about the importance of forensic science, investigative integrity, and the need for independent oversight of law enforcement activities. Today, the former Sodder property in Fayetteville is occupied by other families who may be unaware of the tragedy that occurred on their land decades ago. The children who might have grown up there, raised their own families, and lived ordinary lives in their hometown instead became eternal mysteries, their faces frozen in time on photographs that continue to circulate among people who refuse to let their story be forgotten. The 5 missing Sodder children remain somewhere in the space between life and death, presence and absence, hope and despair, a mystery that time cannot solve but refuses to let die.